Alright, so I think this is probably everyone who's going to show up, so let's go ahead and get started. So, like I said, we are on page 13. The section is Image Politics. The press sees the established governmental leadership as essential to the maintenance of social order, and it gives more credence to public officials, corporate representatives, church leaders, and university officers than it does to protesters, taxpayers, consumers, workers, parishioners, and students. The foremost leader in the United States is the president, quote, who is viewed as the ultimate protector of order, unquote. A systematic examination of 25 years of presidential news in the New York Times and Time magazine, as well as 10 years of CBS broadcasts, reveals a consistent pattern of favorable coverage of the president, with sympathetic stories outnumbering critical ones by 2 to 1. More often than not, a president's viewpoint, especially if it has no liberal slant, is transmitted by the press with no opposing set of facts. Thus, when President Reagan claimed credit for the 1982 extension of the Voting Rights Act and for appointing more minority members and females to administrative posts and waging a more vigorous enforcement of civil rights than previous administrations, the press faithfully reported his claims, without pointing out that in fact he had threatened to veto the Voting Rights Act and only signed it because it passed both houses by veto-proof majorities, and had actually cut back on minority and female appointments and on civil rights enforcement. And in the 1984 campaign, when President Reagan asserted he would, quote, never, unquote, attack Social Security, most of the major media gave top play to this statement, without noting that in previous years he had repeatedly attacked Social Security, equating it and other entitlement programs with welfare, which he hated. The 1984 presidential election campaign revealed the media's conservative bias to those who cared to look. According to a survey by Editor and Publisher magazine, 387 daily newspapers in the United States endorsed the right-wing Republican Ronald Reagan for president, while 63 supported the Democrat Walter Mondale. And this kind of conservative editorial bias carries over to news coverage, as media critic Ben Bagdikian found looking at earlier studies. It is possible that newspapers might endorse Republicans, print conservative columnists, editorialize in favor of conservative issues, but still counterbalance this, or is it possible that newspapers might endorse Republicans, print conservative columnists, editorialize in favor of conservative issues, but still counterbalance this with a pro-liberal bias in their news columns? In the mid-60s, I looked at the current published studies of political bias in the news. There were 84 systematic studies that found significant bias. There was a very high correlation between editorial policy and news bias. Of the 84 studies of bias, 74 found pro-Republican bias in the news in papers, with pro-Republican editorial policies. There were 7 instances of pro-democratic bias in papers with pro-democratic editorials. Only in 3 of the 84 cases was news bias the opposite of editorial position. So where political bias in the news is found, it is overwhelmingly pro-Republican and pro-conservative. There is much talk of a, quote, liberal conspiracy, unquote, in the press. But the real question is how liberal electoral politics survives at all, with the overwhelming opposition of the conservative press. A George Washington University study of television network evening news during the 1984 presidential campaign found that 5 out of 6 stories on Walter Mondale presented him in a negative manner, focusing on minor mishaps and the candidate's presumed lack of appeal, rather than on the issues he was raising. The conservative biases of the supposedly liberal media have a feedback effect on political life. As John Kenneth Galbraith noted, political conservatism benefits from the deep desire of politicians, Democrats in particular, for respectability, their need to show that they are individuals of sound, confidence-inspiring judgment. And what is the test of respectability? It is broadly whether speech and action are consistent with the comfort and well-being of the people of property and position. A radical is anyone who causes discomfort or otherwise offends such interests. Thus, in our politics, we test even liberals by their conservatism. Candidates learn that if they take a stand on controversial issues, the press is less likely to get their position across to the public than to concentrate on the controversy arising from the position taken. Suddenly, their judgment and suitability will be called into question. So rather than the press using its coverage to fit the campaign, candidates trim their campaigns in anticipation of the coverage. In the act of reporting on political life, the media actively helps shape it. The media create conservative effects by slighting the issues and focusing on candidate image. Even when attention is given to issues, it is usually to conjecture on how the candidate used them to help his image and advance his electoral chances. Once considered an adjunct to political discussion, image now seems to be the whole point of the discussion. Quote, "It is not the issues we are asked to judge, it is the nuances of the presentation," end quote. George Washington University study concluded the media specialist Michael Robinson found no liberal bias in campaign coverage, but rather a hollowness and a lack of content. The campaign was treated more as a horse race than a clash of programs and policies. Who will run? Who will be nominated? Who's ahead? How will voters respond? Who will win? These preoccupations are supplemented with generous offerings of surface events and personality trivia. Commenting on the 1976 presidential contest, Malcolm McDougall observed, with forgivable overstatement, "I saw President Ford bump his head leaving an airplane. I saw Carter playing softball in Plains, Georgia. I saw Carter kissing Amy. I saw Carter hugging Lillian. I saw Carter in dungarees, walking hand in hand through the peanut farm with Rosalind. I saw Carter going into church, coming out of church. I saw Ford misstate the problems of Eastern Europe, and a week of people commenting about his misstatement. I saw Ford bump his head again. I saw Ford in Ohio say how glad he was to be back in Iowa. I saw marching bands and hecklers, and I learned about the size of crowds and the significance of the size of crowds. But in all the hours of high anxiety that I spent watching the network news, never did I hear what the candidates had to say about the campaign issues. That was not news." McDougall's impressions are borne out by studies of the 1968, 1972, and 1976 campaigns, which found that newspapers devoted respectively 56%, 64%, and 61% of their presidential coverage to the personal attributes of candidates. Television gave even more emphasis to personality than the printed media. And in the 1976 campaign, by a ratio of more than 4-1, both print and broadcast media stressed personality in campaign events over issue discussion. The media, like major political parties themselves, treat campaigns not as an opportunity to develop democratic accountability and debate issues, but solely as a competition for office. The focus is on the race itself, with little thought raised about what the race is supposed to be about, what makes it so meaningful, and why should it be considered an exercise in democratic governance. By focusing on human interest trivia, on contest rather than content, the media make it difficult for the public to give intelligent expression to political life and to mobilize around the issues. Thus, the media have, intentionally or not, a conservative effect on public discourse. Given short shrift are the concerns of millions of people regarding nuclear arms escalation, Pentagon spending, tax reform, war in Central America, unemployment, and poverty. The democratic input, the great public debate about the State of the Union and its national policies, the heightening of political consciousness and information levels, all the things democratic electoral campaigns are supposed to foster, are all crowded off the stage by image politics. Not only during election campaigns, but just about on every other occasion, the news prefers surface to substance, emphasizing the eye-catching visuals, the attention-catching special angle report, and the reassuring and comforting stories, while slighting the deeper, more important, but politically more troublesome and more controversial themes. There is so much concentration on surface events that we often have trouble grasping the content of things. So much focus on action and personality that we fail to see the purposive goal of the action. For instance, in 1981, President Reagan dismantled major portions of 40 years of domestic social legislation, initiated enormous tax cuts for rich individuals and corporations, dramatically escalated an already huge military spending program, and launched a series of Cold War confrontations against the Soviet Union, all policies of great import. However, the theme that predominated in most of the stories about those crucial actions was whether Reagan was, quote, winning, unquote, or losing, quote, unquote, in his interests with Congress, the bureaucracy, labor, and foreign governments. Thus, momentous political issues were reduced to catchy but trivial questions about Reagan's political, quote, scorecard, unquote, his efficacy as a leader, and his personal popularity. All right, let's stop there for some discussion. So, what do you guys think about that section?
Sounds familiar. It's nice to hear it. So at least since TV made its breakthrough.
That was kind of my thinking, is like acceptably. Like, I guess there's slightly more, venom for a conservative president from the liberal media today, but only because there's money in it. Like, realistically, it's all exactly the same, and that's,
yeah,
I don't know, a lot to think about. Like, that this sort of structure of control is so effective that it barely has to change over the course of several decades.
Word.
And I mean, not even the discussion moves either. It's like, I don't know. I mean, it's one thing that the actions are the same, but also like the whole thing about or at least in an American context, I guess the whole thing about the liberal media is still there. Like, that is like the perception hasn't even moved a little bit, it seems like.
So here's a thought. The media is still just as conservative as it was back then, but now it seems liberal because politics have moved even farther to the right. Eh?
Yeah, that could be something. For sure.
I did also, that made me think of like that thing he said where it was like, basically, in order to seem reasonable, that the liberals would not say anything that might upset the rich people, which I think everybody here would agree with, but just him just saying it outright like that, I was like, oh, yes, that is a good way to put that thing that I agree with. And it just made me stop for a second and think about it. But also just like how obsessed with respectability, like the Democrats, as for instance, still are.
Yeah, I think that might come from decades of red baiting, or just, could be a fact that at the end of the day, it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie and everyone's in the pocket of the business owners.
Yeah, and the thing that comes down to whenever someone is a bit, like when a politician in an election is a bit like out there in some way, like outside the bounds, it's always about like how electable that person is. It's like the whole discussion, like, oh, is this really electable to be wanting to do these things? I mean, I guess it's the same thing, right? It's like the respectability and the electability is like basically the same discussion.
Let's go ahead on to the next section. Sound good?
Yeah.
All
nice.
right, so the next section is titled Monopoly Politics. Such as it is, media electoral coverage is lavishly bestowed on the two major parties, while minor parties are totally ignored or allotted but a few minutes, if that, over the entire campaign. Thus, the media help perpetuate the pro-capitalist two-party monopoly. In recent contests, presidential candidates of the Communist Party, the Citizens Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' World Party, and others did all the things presidential candidates are supposed to do. They met thousands of voters on street corners, spoke on college campuses at voter forums, issued position papers and press releases, traveled around the country, and probably spoke directly to more people than did the major candidates. But on election day, most voters had never heard of them. Deprived of mass media coverage, a third party cannot reach the voting masses. Most people remain unaware not only of its candidates, but of its programs, issues, and critiques of status quo politics. Simon Gerson, who managed the 1980 Communist Party campaign for Gus Hall and Angela Davis, complained of, quote, the consistent spiking of news about them, unquote. Other third-party candidates testify to a similar experience. As a nationally known ecologist, author Barry Commoner was a frequent guest on national television shows, until the day he was nominated presidential candidate for the Citizens Party and became virtually a non-person. While the local media are sometimes accessible to third-party candidates, especially radio talk shows, it is only when they happen to be visiting the area. Unlike the Democrats and Republicans, who remain a consistent focus for local as well as national media, third-party candidates receive no recurring coverage. Once they leave town, they leave the local media's vision. Being momentary rather than constant, the local exposure they receive is of limited impact. Despite being censored out of campaigns by the mainstream media, third-party candidates do manage to garnish a considerable number of votes, taken together a total of between 1 and 2 million in each presidential election. But the people who vote for them are rendered as invisible as the candidates themselves. During election night coverage of presidential and congressional elections, minor party candidates go unmentioned and their votes unreported. As Peter Camejo, the 1976 presidential candidate of the Socialist Workers' Party, commented, before the election, Democrats and Republicans and the media waged a campaign to convince the American people that a vote for a third party would not count. To convince them further, they simply didn't count the votes for most third-party candidates on election night. Media exposure confers legitimacy on one's candidacy. By giving elaborate national coverage only to Republicans and Democrats, news organizations are letting us know that these are the only ones worth considering. Candidates who are not taken seriously by the media swiftly discover that they are not taken seriously by many voters. Even when they make face-to-face contact with live audiences and with voters on street corners, they still lack legitimacy as candidates for national office, being more a curiosity than a serious choice. People may like what third-party candidates say, because often they are the only ones saying anything, but they usually won't vote for someone who doesn't have a chance. Since third-party candidates are not in the news, they are considered to be not really in the race. And since they are not in the race, this justifies treating them as if they are not news. The argument made against giving national coverage to minority party candidates is just that. They are minor. They do not represent the main concerns of the electorate. They are unknowns and of no significance to the party or to the national campaign. But as Aaron Orange of the Socialist Labor Party stated before a Senate subcommittee, quote, how can a candidate attract the following that would convince the broadcasters that he is a significant candidate? Isn't it a fact that in our present society one can become a significant candidate only as a result of repeated exposure on the airwaves, end quote. Were the media to give them national exposure, third-party candidates might very well win millions of votes, qualify for federal funds, and become serious contenders, as indeed happened when John Anderson ran as an independent in 1980. And even if failing to win the presidency, with major media exposure, the candidate would very likely have a real impact on the issues and the climate of political opinion, as John Anderson did not have because he raised no serious politico-economic challenges to the major candidates, but ran on a quote, I can do it better platform, unquote, thereby making himself safe for big contributors and major news exposure. Candidates from the more radical parties, however, pose serious challenges to corporate power and to the government policies that bolster such power, which is enough reason to censor them. Whether a candidate is a prominent or an unknown personage is less important in determining media treatment than his or her politics. John Anderson was an obscure congressman who did miserably in the 1980 Republican presidential primaries. Yet, given his mainstream politics and safe credentials, he was treated like a major candidate when he later ran as an independent. Dozens of Democratic and Republican contenders, such as Reuben Askew, Wilbur Mills, Patsy Mink, John Ashbrook, Sam Yorty, Paul McCloskey, and Shirley Chisholm, quote, were brought from relative obscurity to the public's attention by the media. Few had any chance of winning their party's nomination and none did, unquote, yet they were treated as real candidates. In contrast, persons like Barry Commoner, Angela Davis, Gus Hall, and Benjamin Spock, the People's Party's presidential candidate of 1972, were nationally known figures. Before Dr. Spock began his campaign, millions of Americans were already familiar with his name, having read his books on baby care, and many knew him as a dedicated peace activist. Yet because of media blackout, only a tiny fraction of the public ever knew of his candidacy and his views, despite almost a year of Spock's active campaigning. To ensure impartiality on the public airwaves, Section 315 of the Communications Act requires that stations give equal time to legally qualified candidates if airtime is granted to any one candidate. In 1959, this, quote, equal time doctrine, unquote, was amended so as not to apply to coverage of, quote unquote, bona fide news events, including on-the-spot interviews, documentaries, campaign appearances, and by the 1960s, debates between major candidates, if sponsored by organizations other than the media. In effect, the broadcast media can give almost any kind of coverage to major candidates without putting themselves under an obligation to other candidates. Meanwhile, the print media are completely free to censor third-party candidates since they do not use the public airwaves and need no public license. To impose an obligation on them to give some space to differing views has been judged an interference with their, quote, freedom of speech, unquote. Yeah, let's discuss that last bit a minute. It's an interesting section.
I had not realized how ridiculous the sort of equal time doctrine has been interpreted. Like, I guess I sort of knew it was ridiculous, but that's just unbelievably bad.
Yeah, might as well not exist at all. But yeah, like, basically, you know, if something goes against the mainstream narratives, the media is free and clear to pretend it doesn't exist at all. And then the public doesn't know it exists either.
And then even if they do kind of brush on it, they just say, oh, well, it's fringe, or no one likes that. The corporate media doesn't like it, but the people actually usually do want it, especially when even if you look at stuff from, say, the Bernie campaign, and we know, like, Bernie is not, like, up there, but if you just look at what happened, wherein people wanted things like Medicare for all, people wanted a lot of the things that he was pushing for, but the media just didn't cover it in the right way if you necessarily wanted people to understand what was happening. And despite all of that, people were still wanted it. It's just they weren't sure if the candidate himself would have been able to be electable, as we were talking about in the earlier section, right?
Yeah. So, do any of you guys watch The Simpsons? This is relevant, I promise.
I do not, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can't say I do.
There was Treehouse of Horror. That's their Halloween special. I want to say it was back in the 90s. And the episode was about two space aliens who wanted to enslave humanity, Kang and Kodos. And they disguised themselves as the Democrat and Republican candidates. And at the end of the episode, they're unmasked. And Kodos is like, it's a two-party system, you have to vote for one of us. And one of the people says, well, I think I'll vote for a third party. And Kang says, what, and throw away your vote? And at the end of the episode, it shows that Kang has been elected and humanity is enslaved.
Yep. Yeah, I think I've seen like a meme or something showing that. I think I've seen something talking about that. But yeah, 100%. It's just true, you know? That is exactly how do you say, Western democracy functions.
Don't blame me. I
Quote, unquote,
voted for
democracy.
Kodos.
Exactly. Oh gosh, I could go on a really long rant about how liberals get when they sort of start, attacking quote unquote right wingers for voting for the fascist candidate. It's like, but you were voting for a fascist candidate too. I don't know what. Like, you're not you're not actually helping anything right now. But
Yeah, fascist candidate who may or may not let you keep your shitty health insurance, and that's literally the only difference.
very big emphasis on the may or
Yeah.
may not.
All right, so Kami Rice, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. Just one really short thing that I was kind of thinking about as we were reading this too, where they were talking about like the media, and I was just thinking like that or what should be a big story about Tucker Carlson being this like guy who stokes people against news media, but is also like a main source, and they just sort of uncritically accept that, and how it's not a big story. And even when it's talked about in the media, it's not like, boy, isn't it fucked that they're just taking the shit this guy says as a serious source when he's a white supremacist, like, asshole? Nope, none of that. Just, boy, isn't it interesting that he says bad things about the media and yet he's a media source?
Well, I mean,
Mhm.
that's because people who write the news are journalists, and this isn't a big story to them. I mean, that's just his public persona, and behind the scenes, they're all buddy-buddy, People don't alienate their sources, as Parenti mentions in a later section. So, basically blow off him talking shit about them on the air because they know it's all for ratings. And, in the background, they have just a regular working relationship with him, like with anyone else on the networks.
All right, so we are on Do the Media Manage Our Minds, correct?
Yes.
Are the media independent of government influence? If not, what is the nature of that influence? Are the media dominated by particular class interests? If so, does this dominance carry over into news content? Does control of news content translate into propaganda? Does propaganda translate into indoctrination of the public mind? And does indoctrination translate into support for policies? These questions guide the present inquiry. Let us run through them again, a little more slowly. In the United States, a free press is defined as one unhampered by repressive laws. As we shall find, government interference with the news is not the only or even the major problem. More often, the danger is that the press goes along willingly with officialdom's view of things at home and abroad, frequently manifesting a disregard for accuracy equal to that of policymakers. To be sure, questions are sometimes raised and criticisms voiced, but most of these are confined to challenging the efficacy of a particular policy rather than its underlying interest, especially if the interests are powerful ones. 2. The news people who participate in the many forums on freedom of the press usually concentrate on threats of the press from without, leaving untouched the question of the coercion from within, specifically from media owners. Are the media free from censorial interference by their owners? Does ownership translate into actual control over information? Or does responsibility for the news still rest in the hands of journalists and editors who are free to report what they want, limited only by professional canons of objectivity? As we shall see, the working press, including newspaper editors and television news producers, and even the top media executives, are beholden to media owners and corporate advertisers. More specifically, the owners exercise control through the power to hire and fire, to promote and demote anyone they want, and by regularly intervening directly into the news production process with verbal and written directives. But does control over media content and personnel translate into ruling class propaganda? Even if we allow that owners ultimately determine what is or is not publicized, can it be assumed that the end product serves their interest and gives only their viewpoint? I will argue that, except for momentary departures, a capitalist ideological perspective regarding events at home and abroad rather consistently predominates. The system of control works, although not with absolute perfection, and is not devoid of items that might at times be discomforting to the rich and powerful. 4. A final concern. Does ruling class propaganda translate into indoctrination of the public? It might be argued that even if the news is cast in a capitalist ideological mold, the public does not swallow it and has ways of withstanding the propaganda. The news may be manipulated by the press lords, but are we manipulated by the news? It is this last question I want to deal with here at some length. For if the press exercises only an inconsequential influence over the public, then we are dealing with a tempest in a teapot and are being unduly alarmist about mind management. Early studies of the media's impact on voting choices found that people seemed surprisingly immune from media manipulation. Campaign propaganda usually reinforced the public's preferences rather than altered them. People exposed themselves to media appeals in a selective way, giving more credence and attention to messages that bolstered their own views. Their opinions and information intake also were influenced by peers, social groups, and community, so the individual did not stand without a buffer against the impact of the media. The press, it was concluded, had only a minimal effect. At first glance, these findings are reassuring. People seem fairly self-directed in their responses to the media and do not allow themselves to be mindlessly directed. Democracy is safe. But troublesome questions remain. If through selective exposure and selective attention, we utilize the media mainly to reinforce our established predispositions, where do the predispositions themselves come from? We can point to various socializing agencies: family, school, peer groups, workplace, and the media themselves. Certainly some of our internalized political predispositions come from the dominant political culture that the media have had a hand in shaping, and directly from earlier exposure to the media themselves. Our ability to discriminate is limited in part by how we have been conditioned by previous media exposures. The selectivity we exercise is not an autonomous antidote to propaganda, but may feed right into it, choosing one or another variation of the same establishment offering. Opinions that depart too far from the mainstream are likely to be rejected out of hand. In such situations, our selectivity is designed to avoid information and views that contradict the dominant propaganda, a propaganda we long ago implicitly embraced as representative of the nature of things. Thus, an implanted set of conditioned responses are now mistakenly identified as our self-generated political perceptions, and the public's selective ingestion of the media's conventional fare is wrongly treated as evidence of the minimal effect of news organizations. In addition, more recent empirical evidence suggests that, contrary to the earlier minimal effects theory, the news media are able to direct our attention to certain issues and shape our opinions about them. One study found that participants exposed to a steady stream of news about defense or about pollution came to believe that defense or pollution were more consequential problems. Other studies found that fluctuations in public concern for problems like civil rights, Vietnam, crime, and inflation over the last 2 decades reflected variations in the attention paid to them by the major media. Theorists who maintain that the media have only a minimal effect on campaigns ought to try convincing those political candidates who believe they survive and perish because of media exposure and lack of it. Just as an aside, that the entire time that's what I was thinking was like, how can we possibly believe this is a minimal effect when literal billions of dollars are spent on various types of advertising? So nice to see that mentioned. And as we saw earlier, the inability to buy media time and attract press coverage consigns third-party candidates to the dim periphery of American politics. The power to ignore political viewpoints other than the standard two-party offerings is more than minimal, it is monumental. Media exposure frequently may be the single most crucial mobilizer of votes, even if certainly not the only one. If much of our informational and opinion intake is filtered through our previously established mental predilections, these predilections are often part of our conscious discernment, not part of our conscious discernment, but of our unexamined perceptual conditioning, which brings us back to an earlier point. Rather than being rational guardians against propaganda, our predispositional sets, having been shaped by prolonged exposure to earlier outputs of that same propaganda, may be active accomplices. Furthermore, there are many things about which we may not have a predetermined opinion. Lacking any competing information, we are often unwarily embrace what we read or hear. In these instances, the media are not only merely reinforcing previously held opinions, they are implanting new ones, although these implants themselves seldom fall upon tabula rasa brains and usually do not conflict too drastically with established biases. For example, millions of Americans who have an unfavorable view of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua came by that opinion through exposure to press reports rather than from direct contact with Nicaraguan revolution. Here then is an original implant. People are prepared to hate and fear a foreign government on the basis of what they read in papers or hear on television and radio. But this negative view is persuasive to them. Is persuasive to them also because it is congruent with the long-standing and largely uncriticized anti-communist Cold War propaganda that has shaped the climate of opinion for decades. Thus, the press can effectively direct our perceptions when we have no information to the contrary, and when the message seems congruent with the earlier notions about these events, which themselves may be in part media created. In this way, the original implant is also a reinforcement of earlier perceptions. Seemingly distinct reports about diverse events have a hidden continuity and a cumulative impact that, again, support previous views. To see this process as one of minimal effects because it merely reinforces existing views and does not change them is to overlook the fact that it was never intended to change them and was indeed designed to reinforce the dominant orthodoxy. As to whether the negative view of the Sandinistas translates into support for a U.S. government policy of aggression against Nicaragua, it is yet another question. For an entirely different set of reasons, such as fear of loss of American lives, fear of a larger war, opposition to the draft, and to the higher taxes needed to pay for a war, people may be reluctant to go along with U.S. intervention. Yet the negative image about Nicaragua propagated by government does leave policymakers with a lot of room to carry out aggressive measures short of direct intervention by U.S. troops. So even if the press does not elicit total public support for a particular policy, it is still not without a substantial influence in creating a climate of opinion that allows the government to get away with a lot, and it prevents a competing opinion about Nicaragua from occupying the high ground in the political arena. Even if those are antagonistic towards Nicaragua constitute but a minority of the public, members of Congress and other politicians find it difficult, if not impossible, to say a positive word about the Sandinista revolution given the publicly visible opinion created by media and government around that issue, given the way that opinion hooks into decades of anti-communist propaganda. If the press cannot mold our every opinion, it can frame the perceptual reality around which our opinions take shape. Here may lie the most important effect of the news media. They set the issue agenda for the rest of us, choosing what to emphasize and what to ignore or suppress, in effect, organizing much of our political world for us. The media may not always be able to tell us what to think, but they are strikingly successful in telling us what to think about. Along with social, cultural, and educational agencies, the media teach us tunnel vision, conditioning us to perceive the problems of society as isolated particulars, thereby stunting our critical vision. Larger casualties are reduced to immediately distinct events, while the linkages of wealth, power, and policy go unreported or are buried under a congestion of surface impressions and personalities. There's nothing too essential and revealing that cannot be ignored by the American press, and nothing too trivial and superficial that cannot be accorded protracted play. In sum, the media set the limits on public discourse and public understanding. They may not always mold opinion, but they do not always have to. It is enough that they create opinion visibility, giving legitimacy to certain views and illegitimacy to others. The media do the same to substantive issues that they do to candidates, raising some from oblivion and conferring legitimacy upon them, while consigning others to limbo. The power to determine the issue agenda, the information flow, and the parameters of political debate so that it extends from ultra-right to no further than moderate center is, if not total, still totally awesome.
Well, not that awesome.
Awesome in the sense that it
I know.
conveys awe. Not that I think he likes it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So something I was thinking about while reading this was, I mean, for sure, I think that probably there are media people or journalists who would like to report differently but are afraid for whatever reason to lose their jobs because of, the rich people own everything. But I also think that, and as much as I'm loath to admit Chomsky ever being right, he has a good point in that the sort of like the media machine, it doesn't even get to the point really, I think, where a lot of journalists are like called into the owner's office and they're like, you better stop reporting on this. It's just like the sort of person who would never report on those, or who's only interested in the things they want to be interested. That's the person who gets the job, and there's no direct coercion necessary. The whole system has already been built to produce this.
And Parenti explains that at length later in the book. That it's a matter of
I can stop saying nice things about Chomsky.
So it's a matter of hiring people whose portfolio demonstrates the correct bias, and even if they're not someone who exactly fits in the publication's ideological mold, they still develop a sense of the lay of the land, what's safe to publish and what's not, and they learn to self-censor based on the general timbre of the publication. And like I said, that's in the future chapters at great length.
I liked when he was talking about what did he say? It's on page 21. So, views that contradict the dominant propaganda, a propaganda we long ago implicitly embraced as representative of the nature of things. I really like the way he says that, because I think that really applies, I mean, probably to a lot of people, but I know that it applied to me heavily when I was younger, where I just accepted a lot of things, like the boundary of like what's acceptable to think about things based on sort of loosey-goosey feelings that I had picked up from the general culture and had never really bothered to analyze. And I suspect that's pretty broadly true of a lot of people.
I wish Gomer was able to be here to join us for this, because that's something he's done a lot of thinking about too. And we've kind of discussed it a little. I think kind of what really merits re-emphasizing is the line, the media may not always be able to tell us what to think, but they are strikingly successful in telling us what to think about. As long as, the bourgeoisie controls the narrative, as long as they have the initiative, they're just forcing us to react to issues on their terms. So the thing we got to think about, is how to get ahead of them and how to neutralize their attempts to drive discourse. So that's something that, we as communists need to think about.
Yeah, I've definitely thought about this a lot as well, because I do like keeping track of everything that's going on, but of course relying on bourgeois media clearly is not enough to get you all the information that you need. I mean, it's not enough to get you any information, if I'm being completely honest. So trying to sort of not fall into the existing sort of the hegemonic narrative, but instead, of course, keeping track of what they're saying, but only insofar as it's necessary to keep up with what is already there, but then also having your own sort of study or your own sort of area where you're trying to maintain a constant understanding of. So for example, I'm constantly trying to expand my understanding of, in particular, anything in relation to deal with Africa, whether it be its relationship to China, its relationship with settler colonial, with imperialist nations such as like France or America, just to kind of get a good understanding of what is going on in the continent itself, so that I can have a more sort of just a better understanding of what is happening, how things are developing, etc. And so by sort of centering that and trying to have both a historical and of course a current understanding of what's happening across the continent, I can get a fuller picture of what's happening, and then kind of relating that to everything else. And then through doing that, I've found that I can sort of cut through a lot of the weirder narratives that I find people starting to follow and say and stuff. And yeah, something else that I wanted to talk about that's like not really related to that other point is the way in which quote unquote independent media will also sort of foster various forms of trying to maintain like the hegemonic narrative, or serving as an extension of the existing, what I'll describe as like a smoke and mirror system that that media has kind of managed to portray.
But no, they can't go contrary to it, because I mean, people will write them off as the lunatic fringe.
Exactly. And sometimes what they'll do is that they'll have like one big talking quote unquote independent head go up against another big talking quote unquote independent head, and then they just like battle it out over some, like, when you think about it in the grand scheme, trivial topic, and then the entirety of for example, left Twitter is talking about this one thing, and it's like, why are we talking about this? This is not like, if you think about it, this is not relevant to any of the things and any of our principles. This is just like a spat between two people that really and truly, if you think about it, we shouldn't even care about them.
Yeah, and I mean, there's, a million things like that, and they're all, means of derailing, basically, to, get us away from being able to form a coherent narrative and to treat, the problems of society as isolated particulars, like Parenti said, and reducing larger causalities to immediately distinct events. I'll go ahead with the next section unless there's more you guys want to talk about.
I'm good to move on.
All right. So last section of the chapter is Beyond Orwell's 1984. The news media operate with far more finesse than did the heartless, lacerating instruments of control portrayed in George Orwell's 1984. The picture Orwell draws of a Spartan barrack society with a centrally controlled electronic surveillance system barking exercise commands at a hapless, demoralized Winston Smith in his home leaves no doubt in Winston's mind and ours that he is being oppressed. Something quite different goes on with our news media. For instance, for 25 years, the United States portrayed the Shah of Iran as just as the State Department and the big oil companies wanted, a benign ruler and modernizer of his nation, rather than as the autocrat and plunderer he was. Hailed as a staunch ally of the West, the Shah was photographed with presidents and senators and regularly interviewed on American television. I think this is the guy that they put in power in one of the CIA's first coups in the early 1950s. Personality profiles and features were run on him and his family, making him a familiar and perfectly likable public personage, with not a word about the thousands of men, women, and children, the students, workers, and peasants this personable fellow had tortured and murdered. Here was an Orwellian inversion of the truth, if ever there was one, but most of us didn't know it. When the Iranian students took over the U.S. Embassy in 1979 and took American hostages, one of the demands was that the U.S. media publicize the Shah's atrocities. For a short time, the American public was treated to some of the truth, to testimony by persons who had suffered unspeakable oppression. We heard of parents and children tortured in front of each other, including one youngster displayed before the cameras, who had his arms chopped off in the presence of his father. It left many people shocked, including members of Congress who, like the rest of us, had been taught by the media to think of the Shah as an upright person, worthy of millions of dollars in U.S. aid and CIA assistance. The sinister commandant who tortures Winston in Orwell's 1984 lets us know he is an oppressor. The vision of the future is of a boot pressing down on a human face, he tells the victim. The ideological control exercised in the United States today is far more insidious. Power is always more secure when cooptive, covert, and manipulative than when nakedly brutish. The support elicited through the control of minds is more durable than the support extracted at the point of a bayonet. The essentially undemocratic nature of the mainstream media, like the other business-dominated institutions of society, must be hidden behind a neutralistic, voluntaristic, pluralistic facade. Quote, for manipulation to be most effective, evidence of its presence should be non-existent. It is essential, therefore, that people who are manipulated believe in the neutrality of their key social institutions, unquote, writes Herbert Schiller. If Big Brother comes to America, he will not be a fearsome, foreboding figure with a heart-chilling, omnipresent glare as in 1984. He will come with a smile on his face, a quip on his lips, a wave to the crowd, and a press that A, dutifully reports the suppressive measures he is taking to save the nation from internal chaos and foreign threat, and B, gingerly questions whether he will be able to succeed. All right, and we are through chapter 1. All right, and now Don't Tread on Me was one of the battle flags in the U.S. Revolutionary War, I believe.
So to be fair, I'm sure that Orwell would have loved it if he could have spawned a phrase that a bunch of conservatives use.
It's kind of strange how much like Orwell's work has sort of permeated a lot of what people like, a lot of discourse in general, even if people don't even necessarily know it, you know. Like, for example, I can't think of a person that doesn't know what Big Brother is, you know.
And it's built up this perception, like he says, that oppression always looks like oppression, and that, that real life villains are going to twirl their mustache just like fictional ones.
Yeah, that's and I guess that's also kind of a part of it, right? Is focusing so much on the aesthetic that you lose kind of touch with what the material reality of all of it is.
Yeah.
Something that I'm curious about, because I was thinking about how like they showed all those images of what it was actually like in Iran, and I found myself thinking like, I can just think of so many people in America who would be like, well, good or whatever, or something awful, And I wonder how prevalent that was at the time. Like, have we been trained to be worse as a society, or would it be about the same? Would a bunch of people, I guess, yeah, a bunch of people probably would be really disturbed by it. They fall for every single thing that America says about every other country, so presumably they care.
Well, I think there's fewer people who would say, well, good, they deserve it, than there were in previous generations. But, it's just that now the people who are sociopath have, a much broader platform with the internet and all. I mean, you can go anywhere and see people saying horrific shit.
True. That was really all I had to say about that. It was just something I was thinking about as we were reading it. I was like, would it be better now or worse if people got to really see the horrendous things that happen in order to prop up our society? But I suppose that answers itself. Or if it wouldn't bother people, they wouldn't bother hiding it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wish I knew a bit more of the specifics, but I think it was it Libya? I don't remember exactly. No, it wasn't Libya. It was before that. They like effectively were actively showing a lot of the bombing and stuff that the US is doing, and it like the US public very clearly reacted to it negatively, and ever since then they've never ever shown like a single bombing that the US does to like another nation again. Like they just didn't do it again because they realized like, yeah, like people, no matter how much you try to sort of manufacture this this fascistic tendency within your citizens, like they're still gonna have like at least some level of empathy, and so like the average citizen isn't gonna be able to stomach that type of thing. Like you're like the only, like, again, like as we were mentioning before, it's only really the sociopaths that will really see that kind of thing and say, yeah, good. Yeah, good.
So I'm actually gonna grab a paragraph from another thing I'm reading. This is an article I just started reading about the domestic applications of counterinsurgency tactics. But repression does not always come dressed up in riot gear or breaking into offices in the middle of the night. It also comes in the form of the friendly, quote, neighborhood liaison, unquote, officer, the advisory boards to local police departments, and the social scientist hired on as a consultant. Repression is, first and foremost, a matter of politics. It is the means the state uses to protect itself from political challenges, the methods it employs to preserve its authority and continue its rule. This process does not solely rely on force, but also mobilizes ideology, material incentives, and, in short, all of the tools and techniques of statecraft. We have to understand repression as involving both coercion and concessions, employing violence and building support, weeding opposition, and ceding legitimacy. That is the basis of the counterinsurgency approach. So, it's the carrot and the stick. The bullet and the ballot, I guess.
You said the bullet and the ballot?
Yeah.
That's poetic.
That's interesting to think about, though. Like, I don't know, there's just so many things that, I mean, like Parenti was saying, like, that just sort of, like, accept passively. Even stuff that I, like, disagree with. Like, sometimes I need it to be said out loud. Or, like, things that, like, I would agree with. I just need it to be said out loud to, like, really start to make sense of it. I was just thinking about, like, what you were saying there with, like, the sort of, like, double nature of it, how it can't just be one thing. It's got to be sort of, like, both, the boot and a pat on the head. I guess I don't even necessarily have anything to say about it. Just I hadn't really thought about it in that way until you had said that. I don't know. It's really turning my mind around right now. Sorry, I don't have anything good to say about it. Just like it's really like it's burrowing into my head.
Yeah, no, let it percolate for a while. So yeah, anyone got anything else on the chapter?
I had something and I entirely forgot it. So
All right.
Oh, I just remembered. Yeah, when you read that that piece earlier about the way in which like from the article, the way in which the state protects itself using these like various elements, and I couldn't just the first thing that came to my mind was Black Panthers and the way like California all of a sudden banned open carry, and
Yeah.
the war on drugs. Like those are the main two things that came to my mind the moment you were reading that.
Exactly. And I mean, the war on drugs gets spun as, making our communities safe and protecting the children and crap like that, but everyone knows it's about oppressing the Black community. Well, not everyone knows. I mean, we know, but a lot of people buy into the propaganda.
Yeah, it was about destroying all of the organizational efforts that Africans were doing at the time. Yeah, 100%. It's the how do I say it? The thing is that, because for example, the war on Vietnam, it could vary, or the pushback against the anti-war movement against Vietnam, or the the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War was very heavily pushed by like SNCC and SCLC and those like very Black organizations, and so we can see that the empire recognized that, okay, well, this group is doing too much. This group is causing way too many problems for the functioning of empire. We can't have them functioning in the way that they are. We need to do as much as we can to ensure that these people do not organize, do not function well within their communities, because if they do that, it will mean the destruction of our society as we know it.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things I'm gonna mention in this thing I'm working up about dual power, is that dual power does not exist in peacetime and cannot be built peacefully. So the original quote is, "Dual power is in its essence a regime of social crisis signifying an utter dividedness of the nation. It contains within itself potential or actual civil war." And that's from the original text on dual power.
Because what you're doing with like developing dual power systems is to build capacity for challenging for one power system to challenge the other power system. I think that's probably the most kosher way to describe it. You're ensuring that people can exist outside of the existing one, wherein they're constantly exploited, and everyone else is also constantly exploited, and create one where there's far less exploitation from the ways in which it's developed. And then of course the hegemonic one is going to fight back against. I was saying all of that to say that it's all building capacity for a revolution, or that it's all a part of a revolutionary movement. That's really all I meant to say. That was it.
All right, so I think that's it for the discussion. Kwame Rice, you got anything else?
No, that's everything I had, but thanks for leading it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. I'm happy to. I've been, itching to get back to this book. I mean, I really, really want everyone to read it.
Hopefully at least more people will listen to the recording then.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, everyone have a good night, and see you guys at the next one.